Okay, our next speaker is Randy McIntosh, who has been a foundational member of the Brain Connectivity Workshop and a core and founding scientist in the field of brain connectivity. Needs no further introduction. Thank you very much for coming at us at 4 o'clock, coming to us at 4 a.m. or whatever it is there in Toronto, Randy.
Now it's actually not too bad, 7:30. I think this is sort of like to help simulate the feeling of jet lag that we typically have at brain connectivity when we're all coming to the same place. So it works out okay. So let me get this queued up, hopefully. So hopefully you can see my first slide. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. So the presentation I'm going to give is sort of in the spirit of how brain connectivity started, and that it started as sort of chalk talks, really, or talks that were done with a pen and easel. That's what I'm trying to sort of achieve today. At the bottom of the slide, you see the inspiration for this was also from a talk that I saw in the fall of last year from Herman Haken, where he walked through sort of the history of synergetics, which is a core principle that has been carried on in the tradition of dynamical systems, and certainly in the tradition of brain connectivity that Victor talked about earlier this week. The thing about Herman's talk, which I found just fascinating, was he had his talk written out on paper, and he walked through the derivations and the different principles and elements of synergetics in a very elegant and insightful way, and it was captivating. So I'm hoping that my talk will be at least as captivating. I can't guarantee it'll be insightful, but I'm at least hoping to be entertaining, if nothing else. The talk itself, you'll see, actually pulls different pieces of things that were covered over the few days we had for brain connectivity. It covers things that Victor talked about in the first part of the presentation that Lisa Feldman-Barrett covered quite nicely in her presentation yesterday. And it actually even anticipates things that Carl's going to talk with this free energy principle, which I guess now has the capacity to go back in time and influence me in terms of what I'm going to talk about as well. And finally, at the bottom of the slide here, you'll see that I do have the papers I'm going to talk about in the presentation you can download from that URL at the bottom, which I'll put up again at the end of the talk. So what I want to talk about is hidden repertoires. And hidden repertoires, the idea came from work that I've been doing with Victor a year or so over the past several years. And this is the sort of definition from two different perspectives of the idea. And it comes from thinking about what happens when we think about networks configuring themselves in the way that you see in the brain from a dynamical systems perspective in particular. So the first part of the definition on the top here says that hidden repertoires arise when the distribution of parameters underlying state space enables configurations that are possible but seldom actualized. In other words, they're probably hidden most of the time. That's a general statement about what the hidden repertoires might be. From the perspective of the brain, hidden repertoires are functional configurations that are possible for a given architecture. Architecture here can be some combination of sort of core structure plus some changing synaptic weights, for instance, that change the volatility, if you will, the connections between two regions. Again, configurations that are possible for a given architecture, but are seldom visited. And the question becomes, why are these seldom visited? One possibility is they're redundant, so that it doesn't really matter if you go there. They could be inefficient in the sense that even though you can take that pathway, the emergent behavior may be too slow or inaccurate, so it doesn't actually get actualized that up. Or it could be maladaptive. Now, we are talking about an adaptive system, that being the brain, and it could be that some of these hidden repertoires are actually maladaptive, so they kind of get pushed to the periphery and not get used that much. So they are possible, but they may not be used as frequently as one may hope. Down the bottom of the paper, you see some examples of what I'm talking about here. You've got a very simple 4-node network with a structural architecture. And the structural architecture provides sort of a backbone, but it doesn't guarantee that connections are going to be used. It just says that these areas are connected and they can possibly communicate, for example, in the emergence of a behavior, but they need not. So for example, you can have a couple of configurations here which are indicated by the arrows, where you've got one going along this path from the top of the network, going from the back to the front, if you will. And a second configuration, which involves the central node here, activating the nodes more interior to it as well. And a third configuration that we'll say, again, this is illustration, that is hidden, that can happen, but seldom happens in the system. And again, the question is, why does that happen? And that's what we're going to explore in the next few. These aren't really slides, these are pieces of paper. I've got the originals right here that are acting to convey my ideas in a sort of a crystallized way that's sort of inherent to brain connectivity. So I think the main motivation, if you will, or the main inspiration for the idea of hidden repertoires actually came from a paper that Victor gave to me to look at when I was visiting him in Marseille several years ago. And inspired by some work done by his, I think, postdoc, Al-Husani. The paper, again, is in the link, but it's a physical reviews ease paper. And what that paper did was took the Epilepter model, which is one that Victor and his group have developed for looking at seizure propagation in a full brain model. But what was done in this particular paper is they looked at a broader parameter range for the Epilepter model. So what you see in the top of this figure is the state space for the Epilepter. And we have the actual Epilepter that's used here, and its behavior if you change the parameter Z, which moves the system from being at rest into a seizure domain. This is the phase space, and you see here a slow movement going down, and then you start having the spiking behavior and the spiral attractor, and then an X bifurcation going back down through a slow move through the resting state. If you push that into the time domain, you see the activity here, spiking, slow movement here in resting state, spiking again, slow movement resting state, and then it will continue going forward. What was done here is that they expanded the parameter range to explore down and push the Z parameter down further. And this actually says RSE should be. And what you find when you cross a separatrix in this parameter space is you move from the seizing behavior to a very slow sort of a limit cycle. And if you plot that in the temporal domain, you get this very spiking behavior, and then there's slow oscillation, low spike, slow oscillation, spike, slow oscillation, spike. The physiologists who looked at this behavior in the model said that looks like refractory status epilepticus. And that was interesting because that was not necessarily a goal of the model per se, but it was actually a feature that emerged that was hidden in the initial parameter space. But when you push the parameter space to a broader domain, you actually then create this refractory status epilepticus behavior. And that was then carried in the paper itself, then carried to a mouse to explore a bit further, suggesting that in fact this is potentially a parameter space that you can move the system from being in the seizure mode to the status epilepticus, which has very specific implications then for clinical extension. Just to finish this off here, the points for this particular slide is to suggest, first of all, and this is something that's coming from the Epilepter model, that a seizure itself is a repertoire of a vertebrate brain given enabling changes in parameter space. So you push this to a part of the parameter space where a seizure is possible. And in that space, RSE is a hidden repertoire that may not be visited, which is actually probably good because it's actually very critical to the system if it does in fact go there. But it could be visited if the parameters are in fact moved across the separatrix, that being the Z parameter here. The point here is that characterizing this state and parameter space give hints on how you might navigate this complex system. And that gets back to some of the ideas that Danny Bassett talked about in terms of control, network control theory, being able to figure out how do I move the system from status epilepticus, which is critical back to seizure, which can be controlled more directly. So that was the motivation for this idea of hidden repertoires. And the question was then, can we use that same idea then to extend to, for example, aging and cognition? The talk that preceded this one, the beautiful combination talk between Alex and Jean-Pierre, and there's the spirit of Klaus, did convey the fact that across the lifespan, our brain changes, and there's sprouting and pruning, and that's embedded, of course, in the social context. So you have interactions of intrinsic and extrinsic systems that are impacting the development of the brain. And the trajectory that it goes on actually moves the system through preferred repertoires, so that the dominant pattern of interactions actually changes. And what I've got here, this is an idea about aging and complexity, which is in the review paper again, which is in the URL I mentioned earlier. You've got a local set of connections, and you got the long-range connections. And what happens is that the preferred, if you will, mode of interaction within the space-time structure seems to change with age. And it changes in both healthy aging as well as changes potentially also in aging where there is an at-risk profile. You can characterize these changes in a number of ways. And one way we have done it is using a measure called multi-scale entropy, measuring EEG data, for example, across a number of studies. And if you plot, for example, the information that's essentially integrated across a temporal scale, across the spatial scale, you see that peak and that profile changes. And that's what's plotted here. This is essentially a profile of entropy as a function of moving from a fine to a slow, or a fine to a coarse time scale, or moving from a local to global spatial scale. This is a bit, I'm taking liberties here in terms of the connections, but this is just to get you a general idea that there is in fact this change. If you plot entropy now as a function of these scales, the young are shown in a solid line. Healthy old, these are people who are healthy for the cohort, show this in this dotted line. And then people who are at risk, or who are actually showing cognitive impairment, are shown in the dotted line. So the young, their preferences for the sort of middle range. For the older individuals, they tend to shift more towards local and faster interactions, which suggests that they're actually focusing more on local circuits. And that drops down as you go to the longer range circuits. At risk, you have both a slight reduction in the local capacity, but an increase in global. And actually, the more recent work that's been done on this suggests that they have this idea of long-range connections that actually are rather sparse in the sense of the information that's integrated relative to what could happen elsewhere. So they're inefficient, if you will, with the long-range connections. And that actually predicts cognitive decline. We've seen that, for example, in Parkinson's patients who, before they show cognitive decline, clinically will show this profile in the curves. And we see that at people who are showing mild cognitive impairment before they transition to dementia as well. And also this relates as well to sort of general brain health status if you look across a cohort of individuals. And this suggests then that if you can look at modeling this system in terms of the changing the space-time structure and then exploring what the repertoires are for that system. And the notion then being is if we do a deeper dive, we might be able to find the configurations that allow the old brain that's healthy to maintain this profile and figure out what happens to transition them to the at-risk patients, and whether there are configurations or repertoires that are important for maintaining brain health, and also repertoires that seem to be signaling a risk for transition to cognitive decline. I have no idea, Breaky, how I'm doing for time. I'm just going to continue, I think. So I'm doing 5 slides though.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, we've got time.
Okay, I'm on number 4. And this links into much more into the work that Giulio had talked about. And I think it reinforces some of the discussions that we just had in terms of what happens to our brain that allows us to have the kind of richness to our essence, if you will, our existence that's not necessarily there in other primates and probably in other vertebrates as well. Probably not even in invertebrates, although octopuses are another situation that we can talk about later. Here I have two very simple examples of what I'm talking about in the sense of repertoires and how that relates to our experience. And this is an example that Giulio has used a lot in his writings, which I think is quite illustrative of what it means to have not just an experience, but the experience within the capacity of what your system can do. So here on the left, we have what we'll call a photodiode, and a photodiode with a very simple repertoire where it has some state space that results in state X or attractor X being activated. And then when X is activated, the photodiode said that there's a light on. And then the human over here has X and has another repertoire we'll call Y. It's a slightly different configuration of the state space. For simplicity, we'll call the photodiode, just so we can actually talk about the photodiode as a person, we'll call him Ernest. So this is Ernest, the photodiode. Say hello to Ernest, please, everybody. Thank you. Over here, we have the human, and for ease of communication, we'll call the human Randy, because he kind of looks like me. And I took liberties because it's my talk. So both Ernest and Randy detect the light through X in state space. But Randy experiences the light in a richer context of potentials. So when that light comes on in a dark room, Ernest sees the light and that's it. Randy sees the light and also knows that that's not a bell or not a different light. If the light changes color, for example, let's say instead of it's a white light, from a white light to a red light, the photodiode will say it's a light. It doesn't really know that it's a red light or a blue light or a white light. Randy, because he has a broad repertoire, will say, oh, that's not just a light, it's actually a red light, and it's not a blue light. So there's more experiences that tell us what's happening, actually happening, and what's not happening. The importance of being earnest in this context is that Ernest can respond very quickly when an event happens, but it doesn't have the capacity to change its behavior in light of a change in, for example, the number of lights that are presented or going from a light to a sound. It will always say it's a light. So that's really a good advantage, for example, adaptivity. So you do have circuits like that in the brain where it's on and it responds very quickly, but it can't really change its behavior. It's not really flexible. The importance of being Randy is that Randy can do more. Randy can see not just a light, but a light, and he knows that the light's in this room and that there's a broad space of where the light could be, and that's some of the points that Giulio had made in his talk. So that point, and this is again in the last part of the slide here, is that our current experience exists in the context of what is possible. So it's not just that we're having the experience, but we're having the experience in the context of other things that could have happened. And that potential is quite important, I think. And this is, I think, also in Giulio's idea for the phenomenology of our experience, not just the experience per se. And that gets back again to the repertoires that could have been enacted, but weren't necessarily enacted for a given experience. And that contributes to our consciousness, if you will. Okay, this is my final slide, just to kind of tell you where I think we can go next with this. The first very important point, and this comes back to Victor's presentation earlier, actually in the very first talk. The formulations I've talked about here, and these formulations come entirely from thinking about the brain from a dynamical systems perspective, but then taking it to a higher level. That the formulations about hidden repertoires and dynamical systems is not unique to the brain. That's also true of structure, flow, and manifolds, that the notions can be extended elsewhere. And this kind of gets back to, again, what Jean-Pierre had said earlier, and also some of the discussions earlier about the interactions of the brain with other systems. That our brain does not exist by itself. It's in our head. Our head's in our body is in my room is in the social cultural context. And a lot of these things can be characterized from the perspective of these complex adaptive systems and tap into some of the core principles of complex adaptive systems. They have been enacted and researched in other systems much better than they have been done in the brain. So there is potential for linking what we're talking about here to things like immunology, to things like social interactions and so on, and see how these repertoires emerge in different systems and see if it's similar in the brain. We identify what the core features are that enable that to happen in one system and see if we can carry that to another system. Be quite different in the brain. For example, we saw some very good evidence for that in the previous talk, that the architecture that gives rise to these complex behaviors in the brain could be quite different, but at least the emergent feature and how they can be characterized in a dynamical systems perspective could be quite similar. And that similarity allows us then to make the connections between these different systems. Things like multi-scale behavior, things like emergence, things like embeddedness, things like nonlinearities can be extended across different systems, and we can use that potentially to link these different systems. Signals and boundaries is a very, very important feature of dynamical systems that allow exploration, for example, within a confined space for a given part of the system without necessarily having this catastrophic effect on other parts of the system. So how those develop is quite important, and that's something that Victor talked a little bit about in his presentation, but it's something we definitely need to expand upon. And then finally, if this is a principle, of course, we have to figure out how to build these things. And this is looking at things like development, both in terms of within our species, but also across species and across different systems. So the idea of these hidden repertoires allows us to consider a balance between resilience and flexibility. And Victor, again, talked about some of this in the idea of building these invariant manifolds, where there is a part of parameter space where you can use the same parameter settings, if you will, same parameter selections or distributions to generate effectively the same qualitative behavior. And that gives us some resilience, but the question is, how do you balance that against flexibility, allowing the system to enable a new behavior to emerge for a slight change in the parameter space? I've been thinking about that in the context of random plasticity, which is something I'm looking at quite closely now. I think that plasticity in the brain is actually quite ubiquitous. But the challenge, of course, is if it is ubiquitous, how do you constrain plasticity so it doesn't have this explosive cascade? So credit assignment is one way to do that. And potentially from a higher level, actually, the free energy principle can give us some objective functions to try and figure out how to minimize these things so they come together quite well. You'll notice that what I just did is linked the very first talk from Victor to what's going to happen next in the last talk with Carl. So I'm trying to make, again, the connection between all these different features and say there's something hidden in there that could be quite important for how our brains evolved. So with that, I will finish and open up the floor for questions. Thank you for your attention.
There's many people clapping.
The sound of one hand clapping. Yeah.
Thank you. A really beautiful talk. Lovely walk through all the different areas. Before I go to the Q&A, actually, Susan Fitzpatrick put a question in the chat panel, which links back to Athena's talk. So Susan's question, which she might want to ask unmuting in a moment, but I'll read it out anyway. Could the energy requirements of these repertoires be a contributor to why they are, quote, unfavored? And then with Athena's talk, particularly with anesthetics or with other biochemical challenges, you know, you see some of the unfavored repertoires, state 4 in her work, suddenly being a lot more favored. We often don't really think of, well, I don't think of the energy constraints operating on all the different network configurations. So what are your thoughts on that, Randy?
Yeah, I think that's one of the, this is again getting back to something that I think it was Lisa who mentioned this notion of what the brain's for. I might be misremembering, because there is this idea of energy requirements to enable certain configurations. And in that getting back to this notion of signals and boundaries, that may in fact be the way that signals and boundaries are formed in the brain, is by considering in a global sense, what is the cost of having certain configurations taking place, and trying to bias the system more so it has a balance between energy expenditure to achieve a goal, but making sure that it actually is maintainable. So there's a constant balance between having to utilize energy to survive, but making sure the energy utilization can be balanced so you actually don't expend too much energy and end up falling down the stairs or falling in the middle of the field and get eaten by a kangaroo or something like that. So.
Yeah, and interestingly, on that point of energy, Gustavo's talk about turbulence, these magnificent macroscopic dynamic structures, but the energy is all dissipated right at the smallest scale. So there's a nice link there between the macroscopic repertoires that you were speaking and spiking neural states.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of connections to be made still, on a lot of work. My talk is purposefully abstract so that it seems to encompass everything. It wasn't the intent, because that makes it sort of untestable. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of connections that can be made to work that's been talked about today. Gustavo also had the ideas around the oh my God, I forgot the term now. It's not avalanches, but it's sort of it's predecessor. Ignition nodes, yes. So the ignition nodes might signal configuration changes, which are necessarily could be adaptive, and we're exploring for a certain kind of configurations. Victor's been looking at that in ideas, looking at neural cascades as well, whether those are indications of that a configuration is changing now to explore new repertoire, and that gives us an opportunity then to explore other avenues around that change or bifurcation. It's likely is in that space.
So Susan has her hand raised, and then we'll go over to the Q&A window.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, good to see you. It's been 20-something years, I think, since the last time we were in the same room. But and thank you, Randy, for that beautiful talk. And I'm turning on my camera because no one wants to see me before I've had a chance to comb my hair and brush my teeth. But anyway,
I don't have that problem.
So Randy, thank you. That was a remarkable talk, really beautiful. And I thank you for addressing these questions about energy constraints, because I also think that this is an issue that often gets left out of a lot of the abstract computational work. I mean, the brain doesn't waste its currency. And so we have to think sometimes about what the energetic constraints are. And I like this balance of flexibility and vulnerability. So I was wondering, in some of these, I'm calling them unfavored, but these hidden sort of repertoires, right? That there is probably a number of factors that may contribute to their configuration. You can think about, small tweaks to genetics, to receptors, to feedback loops, right? And again, will this get to some of the vulnerabilities that we also see across developmental disorders? And I would say that probably and Michael can speak to this, most neuropsychiatric disorders are probably developmental in nature, right? They don't just suddenly occur. They've been occurring over a long period of time. Yeah. So how do these hidden repertoires get unhidden, right, through these biological vulnerabilities that then have this ongoing interaction with every way that an individual will now experience the world, from basic perception up to social and complex social interactions?
Yeah, great question. And this is something it's come up actually in the discussions over the past couple of days as well, and I'm glad you brought that up. There was a section I eliminated from the draft of my slides talking exactly about that, because I thought it was going to come up in a discussion. I'm glad I played my cards right there. So I think, so the hidden repertoire we saw in the second slide, where I talked about hidden repertoires in epilepsy and status epilepticus, that's one way that these vulnerabilities can manifest. Another way, I think, and this is something that we talked about with this paper that just came out in terms of the changes in structure that happen with myelination and pruning, for example. change the architecture, again, the architectural capacity of the brain. And there could be hidden repertoires that are emerging that don't ever get visited until a certain thing happens, and that's usually the transitions that result in psychotic episodes, for instance. So the question then becomes, if we think about the emergence of things like psychoses as the transition, or almost like a waterfall or a cascade, to what was prior a hidden repertoire, that could change how we think about what the system is moving towards. And so the notion there would be to then start constructing a broader parameter space, and this is something that we're all kind of working on now with the virtual brain, to see if you build a model that transitions across development, that has a parameter space that characterizes the myelination, that characterizes the change in local capacity of the system. You can start tracing out trajectories of brain health that can go all the way back to infancy, and see if there are points in that broader parameter space where there are all vulnerabilities, that if you push the system too far in that direction, you have, I'm going to be, again, taking liberties here, but you could have ADHD emerging, or ASD emerging, or other developmental disorders, or a risk for psychiatric illness later on. It's a huge aspiration, but I think it's possible if you think about things from that trajectory perspective, and that there is a time scale, a very slow time scale in terms of myelination and so on that happens, that will put the system on a trajectory that may in fact go towards having an illness develop later. Again, big aspirations, but I think we're now, the collective discussions we've had over the past 4 days, we can, I think, do that. It's just then a question of, when we find the way to do it, what do we do in terms of actually intervening to help a person not go in that particular trajectory?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. That's excellent. Yeah, because you can begin to see that what you'd like to do then is bend those trajectories in a direction, rather than trying to fix something which actually cannot be fixed, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Look, I can see. Thank you, Susan. And yes, it is nice to see you after 20 years. I can see and feel Vic's prefrontal cortex wanting to break through. But Vic, there's been a few questions in Q&A, so I've definitely come back to you. Dan, I feel like, well, I'll get you to read out, but I feel like we have been exploring this question of yours. Maybe you exercise the free energy time travel loophole, but do you want to sort of explore what you're going to ask in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, no, I think that exactly what you said is true. That kind of what I was hinting at is kind of what has been discussed so far. The idea that this kind of, from my understanding, is the kind of the idea that the hiddenness of this repertoire is relevant, is defined relative to the rest of the state space and the flows that normally happen within the system, right? So a repertoire which is hidden within one system may be normal within another, and maybe kind of with the idea that you're talking about as with like neurodevelopmental disorders, it may be that this repertoire that was kind of hidden and difficult to reach prior to the emergence of a disorder may suddenly become not so difficult to reach and predominate in once kind of that is being developed. Is that kind of the way that you're thinking about these things?
Yeah, I mean, the precision of my thoughts around how one defines a hidden repertoire hasn't evolved to a point yet where I can make those distinctions easily. And that's going to be a challenge, because the question is a hidden repertoire always hidden until you actually have some sort of tragic event happen? Is it always hidden because, or does it go away eventually as well? And there could be a whole family of how these things evolve. So one case might be that as you're learning a task, for example, there could be a number of ways you can achieve that task. And that's something we talked about again earlier, that the output often in an impoverished experimental environment is typically reaction time and accuracy. But the path to get there for a multi-scale complex system like the brain could be a number of different paths. But at some point you will sort of pick one and the rest of that will go away. So that in some case, that could be a trivial example. What I'm thinking about more is kind of what you talked about, Dan, in the sense that you have these, as the parameter space expands and contracts and then enables different kinds of state spaces to happen. Some will be adaptive and will continue to be reinforced. Some will be will be there and perhaps actually tragic and left to dwindle as time goes forward. But if they do get visited again, it could end up being catastrophic in terms of the ensuing cascade that happens after that. But the problem with right now with my formulation is I don't have the specificity to say is hidden repertoire A the same as hidden repertoire B, and I just can't answer that right now because I haven't done enough exploration of whether all hidden repertoires are equivalent or not.
Cool, thank you.
Samuel Rinken has a question in the chat room, Q&A room regarding aging. Samuel?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
All right. Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. That was a fantastic talk. It was really nice and compact.
Thank you.
I was curious about, I know that I've done like some research on aging, and the literature shows a lot about a concept called differentiation, which is, if I remember correctly, healthy older adults have an increased integration and like a decreased modularity, if I recall. And I was curious if this idea of hidden repertoires is something that touches along that, or is that just plasticity, and are those different?
It's a lot. You have a lot of concepts in that question. So de-differentiation is basically the notion that there's less, there are fewer modules, if you will, that are engaged in a task in aging. And that sort of came from old work done by actually my former postdoc, Roberto Cabeza, who identified the fact that the activation patterns in older subjects seem to be using the same parts of the brain for a number of different tasks. I'm not that comfortable with the notion of differentiation. I think that's probably overstating it. There are alternatives that kind of evolve from that talk about the capacity to switch states. And you see, Victor talked about this in his presentation, some work that Damon Battaglia had done with us, that also Joanna Cabral had done, looking at the dynamics in aging and showing that there are fewer switches, the dynamics are slower, there are less network switches, which kind of gets back to what I was mentioning earlier, that there seems to be a bias towards local processing in aging as well. And so that, I think, is maybe a way to go forward. And it gets back to the question of plasticity then, right? So if that's in fact adaptive, how does the system go from making use of long range and short range connections to actually having more of a bias towards maintaining sort of local networks? And those local networks seem to be actually adaptive in terms of the cohort and their cognitive function. And that's a question that we're looking at now. I don't have an answer for it, but it seems to be an important feature of how the brain evolves in the context of lifespan.
Thank you.
Okay, Victor, over to you.
He's frowning. This is going to be bad. Oh no, go.
No, not at all. Thank you, Brecky. And thank you, Randy, for a great, really great presentation. I'm always impressed by your integrative capacity.
Thank you.
I would like to push you a little in the direction you said you deliberately stay abstract, but I'd like to push you to become a little more concrete. In fact, to make it tangible for us. Yeah. So you made the link to different domains, in particular also to turbulence. Gustavo's wonderful talk. When we talk about avalanches were mentioned, cascades. So there we have the notion of information transmission capacity, but this optimality that is being emphasized so often is mostly based on an entropic metric of transmission, of communication. It does not really make any statement of about the states themselves. You have essentially an activity that can percolate through the system. So you can consider this to be a state. However, in the motivation, like from Julia's example with the photodiode, etc., these states, they have to have some meaning. They have to be meaningful. Meaningful dynamic states. It doesn't have to be static states. I'm perfectly comfortable with this level of abstraction. Yeah. So we have the notion of good percolation of activity through the inter-system on the one hand side. We have the notion of multi-stability. We have the notion of a hidden repertoire. It's a lovely framework. How can you now take it, you as a cognitive neuroscientist and with expertise in brain imaging, yeah? You take these concepts and now make them useful in our everyday life. Yeah, how can you translate them in good applications, either in disease or we talked about diagnostic, curative, etc. Make it useful. Do you have any ideas about this?
Some. I mean, some of these we've talked about, you and I together, but I think we can share some of those ideas with the broader audience. And I did sort of mention this earlier as well to Rosalind. I think, so the problem with doing this experimentally is I don't believe we can get enough data from an individual to really map out, again, the repertoire or all of the state spaces. I think we can never do that actually with an individual because we cannot measure them across enough spatial scales and enough temporal scales to get the information we need to characterize the state spaces and characterize the trajectories through state space well. But if we get some indications from experiments on individuals and get other data, so we get the structural data from them, we might get different kinds of functional data, then we make use of our simulation platform, the virtual brain, to start characterizing in the simulated space all the possible trajectories and all the possible states this brain can have, and explore whether there are in fact trajectories that person A has that person B does not, and what is the consequence there for their behavior. And that's starting at a sort of very simple experimental space. For example, I think Petra showed us a very good example using HCP data where you characterize the state space, I think it was an excitatory domain, and that the nature of the manifolds and the nature of the parameters, moving through the parameter space actually predicted intelligence. I think that was a great example of how one might do that. And you could expand that, but I think to make it useful, we have to go back and forth between data and simulation, because the simulation gives us that playground, if you will, to be able to perturb individual's brain in the model, and then again going back to the experiment and saying, well, how does that relate then to their status, their cognitive performance on that task, but also probably broader demographic information.
Okay, I'm going to have one more question from Q&A, and then we'll go to Professor Friston, who's got a question for you. In the meantime, here we are.
That was just at the beginning of the meeting.
The beginning of the meeting. This was brain connectivity in 2006, I think. In
this was before lockdown.
2006, yeah. Wow.
But I digress. Okay, Andre, we've had quite a bit about the repertoire, so I'll go back to a question from an anonymous attendee about aging. How do you reconcile local activity in the elderly, slide 3, with the fact that old people tend to use broad brain regions compared to young people, at least with bold, in order to have the same performance?
So what I mean by local activity is, so the balance there is between using switching networks versus not. So local activity would be basically stay stationary. I'm going to use that term again a bit liberally. So the networks don't really change. What ends up happening then is that the bias in the system would actually be towards local integration until you have to change the network, which requires a change in essentially the weights to allow the network to change. So what ends up happening if you have the same system sort of firing the whole time is you'll have an appearance of a network, even though it may not be, whereas those that are actually not changing their interactions. And that's I think a way to reconcile those two observations. And actually, I should say, if you go, there's in the paper that I put there on the McIntosh review, I talk about that specifically, and the fact that you have higher local entropy in elderly adults, and you see that quite nicely in the EEG signal. So it's, again, suggesting that even though you may have distributed activity, they're not really interacting with one another as much as they might be in young subjects.
Okay, thanks, Randy. And then, hang on. At the same meeting, here's Carl Christ.
I've never seen that picture before.
Okay. Carl, you have had your hand up patiently for some time.
Yeah, I did. Well, I was enjoying the exchanges and the pictures. And I haven't got a beard, so I'm going to try and be in silhouette, so you can't see the absence of my beard. That was a beautiful talk. I presume you're going to call it The Importance of Being Ernest or Randy, when it's finally accepted by peer review.
Indeed. I'm glad you caught that, Carl. I appreciate it.
I caught lots of lovely things in it. So I really actually wanted to answer Victor's question in your behalf by way of fully endorsing that final synthesis. From the point of view of the free energy principle, that is exactly where you end up on. So I just wanted to get this out because I don't know that I'm going to have time to cover it in my 15 minutes where I'm meant to be tying everything together. And I thought it was such an appealing and compelling bit of convergent evolution and consilience. It would be a shame not just to have a record of it. So those structured manifolds, or sorry, structured flows on manifolds in the free energy principle translate into a flow on a synchronization manifold that crucially is also a statistical manifold. Why? Well, because the neuronal activity or connection strengths or the parameters of say your model that define where you are on that manifold stand in for beliefs about what's going on the outside. So they have this representational quality, right? Which means that structured flow on manifolds in the brain are special in the sense that this manifold is a statistical manifold. That's important because it has an information geometry. If it has an information geometry, you can now talk about the repertoire of beliefs that can be contained on that manifold. And there are two important determinants. One's the Riemannian metric, or the measure of distance. How far in belief space do you move when you move your neural activity or you move or your flow on that manifold? Right. And that is actually scored by the Fisher information metric, which just is the precision that everybody's been talking about. So if you're attending and you have very precise dynamics in play at that point in the manifold, that means as you move on the manifold, you're covering a much greater repertoire of beliefs or sort of inferential structures. But of course, the other one is a dimensionality. You can have a one-dimensional photodiode, or you can have a seven-dimensional Friston. And that will also, if you like, constrain the depth and the latitude and the size of the repertoire of the belief space that you can bring to the table at any temporal scale to make sense of the world out there. So I thought that was really nice. And as a final point, of course, that the gradient part of the flow of the structured flows on that statistical manifold is supplied by the variational free energy, and that supplies your objective and your goal. Basically, you're trying to find evidence for your own models of the world. So I think it all hangs together beautifully. But just technically, if you wanted to pursue that from the point of view of information geometry, I think there's great mileage there. I don't think anybody's done that formally, but there's some lovely connections that you could unpack the story. So the question, having got that off my chest, is that clearly to have a more expressive kind of internal landscape that is a statistical restructuring of the world out there that arose from sort of cultural coevolution, involves language and all that good stuff. Clearly that's going to have a repertoire of hidden configurations. And as such, what part of that repertoire do you think is important for consciousness, and does it relate to Anil Seth's formulation of selfhood, or at least minimal selfhood, in terms of counterfactual depth?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't have anything intelligent to say there, because I'm only two-dimensional, Carl, instead of 7, at least right now. See, I haven't read enough of Anil's work to actually know exactly how to answer that. But let me give you my take on the consciousness angle and see if that actually at least gets close to the answer. So my perspective on Giulio's notions of consciousness, I think, are slightly different than his own, in the sense of what possibilities actually means. And the counterfactual aspect of that is actually these. We'll still use the word hidden repertoire in the sense that they exist, but they don't get used. So in some respects, the fact that they don't get used, the absence of them, suggests that they're important for the experience. And that kind of gets back to the notion that I think Giulio's pushing, is that if you unpack a system that has all these potentials, when you unpack that, you see that the capacity is quite large, and that capacity is actually the essence of the conscious experience. Now, he's not here, unfortunately, but in my mind, I think the existence of that framework, or the existence of that collection of nodes in a broader context of other nodes that don't contribute, like the cerebellum, for example, he talks about, because of ganglia loops, they have to be there for the full consciousness that we experience. If you remove them, there is a change in the system. But I think it's the broader capacity of what we could do. And what we have done, that is the core feature of consciousness and the core feature of our experience. And we could dive that down to stuff that Max Schein talked about yesterday, in the sense of these different systems and how they contribute to consciousness, because they all contribute. It's just, then you start getting into sort of the philosophical issue of what really is consciousness versus just experience, and are they different from one another, and so on. But I think it's the merging of what we're actually doing versus what we could do that is the critical feature of what consciousness is. And then we can then go back down to how it gets instantiated, either in the statistical distributions you're talking about, Carl, or one level below, when you start putting in parameter space and sketching out the structure flows and manifolds, and looking at the link between those two, and then the emergent behavior that comes, that we will call consciousness. That's my two-dimensional answer.
Well, that was a perfect, and crucially, that notion of what we could do, what we don't do. I think that's at the heart of Anil Seth's formulation. It's not just beliefs about states of affairs out there in the world. It's beliefs about what I'm going to do next, and having that range, or that latitude, where we have to choose one thing over another thing. That's what he suggests lends the notion of selfhood and agency above and beyond just having perceptual depth.
And this is something that I think, I didn't really appreciate these notions coming from a pure psychology background until I really started talking to Victor about this when we were sitting at tennis courts having lunch with rosé and duck salad, for example, and talking about the fact that we need to think about these things as processes, not that they actually have a flow to them. And that a lot of times when we think about these things like memory, attention, even consciousness, we try to think about them as point estimates. But there is a history and a forward aspect to it that are actually, again, inherent in terms of how the system is organized. That we don't actually stop and think about, we're going to take this step and then that step and then this step. It actually is a complete flow. And that's the important thing about how we construct the system and how it's actually organized in our heads.
Thank you very much again, Randy, for a lovely talk in true brain connectivity fashion, sketched out on paper and delivered with engagement of the other topics that have been before us.